The first thing Elias Colt heard when he rode onto the Hargrove property wasn't silence. It was a gunshot. The crack split the dry Arizona air like a whip. And his horse, a scarred bay gelding named Reckless, reared back so hard that Elias nearly lost his seat. He grabbed the reins, heart slamming against his ribs, pressed his boots hard into the stirrups as the animal spun in a half circle of panic and dust. By the time he'd brought Reckless back to earth, another shot had fired, closer this time, and a voice sharp, furious, unmistakably female, cut through the haze of kicked-up red dirt. I said, "Get off my land." Elias raised both hands. He was a practical man, 31 years old, sun-darkened, broad across the shoulders from 12 years of ranch labor. He had a Winchester in his scabbard and a Colt .45 on his hip. And he hadn't ridden 400 miles across the Sonoran Desert to be shot by someone he hadn't even met yet. He kept his hands high, kept his eyes moving, and slowly turned Reckless toward the sound of the voice. She was standing on the porch of the farmhouse, a 2-story structure that had seen better decades, its white paint long since surrendered to sun and wind. And she had a lever-action rifle leveled at his chest with the kind of calm that told him she'd used it before. She was tall, dark-haired, somewhere around 25, with a jaw set like quarried granite and eyes the color of storm clouds over the Chiricahua Mountains. She wore men's denim trousers, a faded red blouse, and boots that had walked 1,000 miles of hard country. There was a streak of engine grease on her left cheekbone that she hadn't bothered to wipe off. She was, without question, the most startling thing Elias Colt had ever seen in his life, and she was absolutely going to shoot him if he didn't say something intelligent in the next 3 seconds. "My name is Elias Colt," he said, keeping his voice even. "I was hired by the Hargrove estate by an attorney named Caldwell, out of Tucson. He told me this property was abandoned." The rifle didn't move. "Caldwell," she said. The word came out like she was tasting something sour. "Yes, ma'am." "Caldwell told you it was abandoned." "That's what the letter said." He didn't move his hands. "I have it in my saddlebag if you'd like to see it. Though I'd need to reach for it, and I'd prefer not to get shot doing that." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not softness, nothing so generous as that. More like a recalculation. She studied him for a long moment, the rifle still steady. And then she did something unexpected. She looked past him. Scanning the tree line at the edge of the property, the dry creek bed to the south, the empty road that disappeared into the shimmering heat to the east, she was checking if he was alone. He was. "Ride to the fence post and stop there," she said. "Don't come any closer to the house." He did exactly as she asked. She lowered the rifle by inches, not all the way. Not trusting, and walked down the porch steps with that loose-limbed, watchful gait of someone who had grown up in wide-open spaces. She stopped 10 feet from him and looked up. Her eyes were extraordinarily direct. Most people, when they met a stranger on horseback, looked at the horse. This woman looked straight at him. "Get down," she said. Slowly. He dismounted slowly. She held out her left hand. The letter. He reached into his saddlebag with 2 fingers, pointedly, carefully, and produced a folded envelope. She took it without stepping closer, opened it with one hand while the other kept the rifle angled in his direction, and read it with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to absorb information. Fast because slow could get you killed. He watched her face while she read it. Was an expressive face, despite her obvious efforts to keep it otherwise. He saw the flash of something, anger maybe, or something older and more complicated than anger, when she reached a particular paragraph. Her jaw tightened. A muscle moved in her temple. Then she refolded the letter with sharp, precise movements and held it out to him. "Caldwell," she said again. "You know him? He's been trying to take this land for 3 years." She finally lowered the rifle fully, though she didn't sling it over her shoulder. "My father borrowed money from him before he died. Caldwell has been claiming the debt makes the property his." Her chin lifted slightly. "It doesn't." Elias was quiet for a moment, processing this. He'd been hired as a ranch manager, or so the letter had said. For a property described as abandoned and in need of rehabilitation before sale, he was beginning to understand that Caldwell had been somewhat creative with certain details. "So this isn't abandoned," he said. "No, and it's not for sale." "No, and you are." "Margot Hargrove." She said it the way people say their name when they've had to fight for the right to carry it. "My father was Thomas Hargrove. This is my farm. Mine and my sister's." He looked past her, toward the farmhouse, and as if summoned by that look, the front door opened. The girl who stepped onto the porch was younger, maybe 19, with the same dark hair as Margot, but worn in a long, loose braid over one shoulder. She had an enormous orange tabby cat in her arms that appeared deeply unimpressed with the whole situation. She had wide, curious eyes and a smudge of flour on her nose, and she looked at Elias with the particular expression of someone who finds most things in the world genuinely interesting. "Is he dead?" she called out, sounding more curious than concerned. "Not yet," Margot called back. "Should I put on coffee?" A pause. Margot looked at Elias with an expression that suggested she was deeply reconsidering several life choices that had led to this moment. "Put on coffee?" She said the farmhouse interior was a study in organized survival. The front room served as both kitchen and living space, with a caster and stove against the north wall and a long wooden table that had clearly served as workbench, dining surface, and war council table in equal measure. Maps were pinned to one wall, survey maps of the property, water rights documents, what appeared to be hand-drawn irrigation plans. A shelf of books ran the length of the west wall, an eclectic collection ranging from agricultural manuals to what Elias was fairly certain was a translated French novel. The girl with the cat introduced herself as Bertie Beatrice officially. "But nobody calls me that." And she poured 3 cups of coffee with the cheerful competence of someone who found strangers showing up at gunpoint a relatively normal Tuesday occurrence. The third sister arrived from somewhere deeper in the house about 5 minutes later, wiping her hands on a cloth. And she was different from both of them in ways that caught him off guard, where Margot was steel and storm cloud, and Bertie was sunlight and questions. This one was still, quiet in a way that wasn't absence, but rather the quality of deep water. She was perhaps 22, with a lighter build than her sisters, and hair the color of dry autumn grass. And she moved through the room with a self-contained grace that made him think she spent a great deal of time in her own interior world. "This is Sarah," Bertie said. "She talks sometimes, when things are worth talking about," Sarah said, and sat down across the table from Elias and looked at him with pale gray eyes that seemed to be reading something written slightly behind his face. Margot took the head of the table. She'd set the rifle by the door, still within easy reach. Elias noted, and she sat with her forearms on the table and her coffee untouched and told him, in the flat, precise way of someone who has told a story enough times that all the emotion has been edited out of it, what had happened. Their father, Thomas Hargrove, had died 14 months ago. He'd been a rancher, a farmer, a stubborn man who'd built this property up from a dry quarter section into 400 acres of mixed cattle and agriculture. He'd also, in the last 2 years of his life, made the mistake of borrowing heavily from a Tucson financier named Caldwell to expand during a good year. And then a drought year had followed, and the cattle market had softened, and Thomas Hargrove had died with the debt unpaid. Caldwell had moved within the month. He'd sent lawyers. He'd challenged the will. He'd sent men out twice to assess the property who'd needed to be sent away at gunpoint. He'd now apparently hired a ranch manager, Elias, under false pretenses, describing the property as abandoned so that Elias would arrive without context and, presumably, facilitate some part of Caldwell's acquisition strategy that Margot hadn't worked out yet. "But the land is legally yours," Elias said. "The will is clear," Margot said. "Caldwell's lawyers are disputing probate. There's a hearing in Tucson in 6 weeks." Her eyes met his steadily. "I need to still be here and operating when that hearing happens. If I can demonstrate that the farm is a going concern, productive, occupied, managed, the judge will have a harder time ruling in Caldwell's favor." Elias sat with this for a moment. He looked down at his coffee. He thought about the 400 miles he'd ridden and the letter in his saddlebag. And the man in Tucson who had paid his advance, half up front, half on completion, and what exactly? Completion had been meant to mean. He thought about the streak of engine grease on Margot Hargrove's cheekbone. He thought about the way she'd held that rifle, and the maps on the wall, and the French novel on the shelf, and the way Cira was still looking at him like she was reading something. "I'd like to see the property," he said. Margot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" "Because I'm a ranch manager," he said, "and I came a long way. And from what you've described, you need one." The silence that followed had texture to it. Bertie looked at Margot. Cira looked at nothing in particular, which Elias was already beginning to understand meant she was thinking hard about something. "You work for Caldwell," Margot said. "I work for whoever pays me to work," Elias said. "Caldwell paid me to come here. What I do when I get here is my business." He held her gaze. "He lied to me." "I don't work for liars." Another silence. "Longer this time?" "We can't pay you," Margot said. "Let me see the property first," he said. "Then we'll talk about payment." She showed him the land herself. The following morning, on horseback, him on Reckless, her on a pale gray mare named Dust that moved with a smooth, ground-eating canter across the red hardpan. She talked about the land the way some people talk about family. Not with sentiment exactly, but with a specific, intimate knowledge that came from growing up on something and learning. Every scar and strength of it, the south pasture had water. A seasonal creek that the Hargrove family had, supplemented with a hand-dug irrigation channel. Clever work for a family without engineering training. The north section was rougher, broken ground good for little except grazing. But there were 63 head of cattle currently in that section, lean from a dry summer, but alive. The east fields had been planted with winter wheat and showing early green despite the drought. Someone had been working this land with real intelligence and real effort. "Who manages the cattle?" Elias asked. "I do," Margot said. "The irrigation. Cira designed the extension last spring. Bertie and I dug it." He looked at the channel, maybe 40 feet of it, cleanly cut, properly sloped. "The two of you dug this, and Cira supervised," Margot said, with what might, under other circumstances and with a different face, have been a trace of dry humor. "She's very good at supervising." He found himself almost smiling. He looked away before it became visible. The barn was the most honest measure of how hard they'd been working. It was a large structure, built to hold a working ranch's worth of equipment, and it was in a state of continuous triage, one section beautifully maintained. The next in urgent need of repair, the next beyond repair, and stripped for lumber to fix the first. The fence lines told the same story. These women had been fighting the slow entropy of a working property without enough hands. Without enough capital, doing what they could with what they had, prioritizing ruthlessly and tirelessly. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at it all and felt something settle in his chest, a kind of recognition. The way a carpenter feels standing in front of a structure that needs him. "The roof on the east wing of the barn," he said. "How long has it been compromised?" Margot, who had dismounted and was standing beside him, didn't answer for a moment. He looked at her and found her watching him with an expression that was still guarded, still carefully neutral. But something in it had shifted slightly from the rifle on the porch version of the night before. "Since July," she said. "We've been patching it. Patches won't hold through winter rains." He walked to the east wing, looked up at the rafters. "I'd need a full reskin on these 3 sections. The crossbeam here is load-bearing. See this crack? That needs to be sistered before the roof work or the whole thing comes down in the first storm." A pause. He was still looking at the rafters. When he looked back at her, she was studying him with those storm-gray eyes. "I actually know what you're doing," she said. It wasn't flattery. It was closer to a recalibration, the same kind she'd done on the porch, checking the tree line. "I've been doing it since I was 16, he said. "Why did Caldwell hire you?" It was a good question. He'd been thinking about it since the previous afternoon. "Because I'm good at it," he said, and because he needed someone who'd show up and get to work without asking too many questions about the circumstances. He paused. "He misjudged me on the second part." She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet the barn settled around them, the sound of cattle somewhere distant, wind moving through gaps in the siding, dust and reckless breathing softly in their stalls. 6 weeks, she said. That's what I have. I know. The fencing on the north boundary is down in 3 places. Cattle have been drifting. She said it without visible frustration, just fact. The pump on the secondary well is stripped. We've been hauling water to the north section by hand. Another fact? The wheat field needs another irrigation run before the temperature drops, or we lose half the crop. He nodded slowly, cataloging all of this. I can fix the pump today, he said. Tomorrow I'll start on the fencing. The barn roof, he thought about it. 2 weeks if I have help. 1 if I push it. You're assuming you're staying. I'm assuming you need help, he said. Whether I'm staying or not is your decision. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the barn's high windows and long, dusty shafts, and it caught the planes of her face at an angle that made him abruptly, uncomfortably aware of how close they were standing. He'd drifted toward the rafters without noticing, and she'd followed to look where he was looking. And somewhere in the middle of that, they'd ended up about 3 feet apart in a space that suddenly felt smaller than it was. He took a step back. Professional. Appropriate. She either didn't notice or pretended not to. Fix the pump, she said finally. We'll see about the rest. He fixed the pump in 3 hours. He found Bertie sitting on the edge of the well shaft watching him work. The orange tabby in her lap, asking questions with the focused curiosity of someone who genuinely wants to understand the mechanics of things. Her name, he learned, was Tangerine. The cats, that is, Bertie seemed to collect names and stories the way other people collected river stones. For the pure sensory pleasure of them, Margot was going to write to Tucson for a pump mechanic. Bertie told him conversationally, watching him align the stripped gear assembly. But that would have cost money we don't have, and Sierra said we should try to fix it ourselves. But Sierra had never fixed a pump before either, and Margot said she paused. Actually, what Margot said had some words in it that I probably shouldn't repeat. Elias looked up from the pump housing. Your sister seems like a woman who knows exactly what she wants. She always has, Bertie said. Even when she was little, she decided things, and then they were decided. She scratched Tangerine behind one ear. It got harder after Papa died. Because she decided everything would be fine, but things kept not being fine, and she had to keep deciding harder. He was quiet for a moment, fitting the gear back into alignment. And you? He asked. What did you decide? Bertie smiled, a quick, bright thing. I decided not to decide. I decided to just be here and see what happened. That drives Margot absolutely crazy. He understood, somehow, that was exactly the point. He spent the afternoon on the north boundary fence, riding the line and pulling wire and driving posts, working fast and methodically in the dropping autumn sun. The cattle were nervous about the new presence, they always were, but they settled as the afternoon wore on, and he moved among them with the patient, unhurried manner that working animals recognized and trusted. By the time the sun started westering, he'd closed 2 of the 3 gaps. He rode back to the barn in the last light and found Zero there. She was doing something to the tack, cleaning it, oiling it, working her way down a line of bridles with quiet, focused attention. She looked up when he came in, unsaddled, reckless, started rubbing him down, and didn't speak for a while. Neither did he. It was, he discovered, a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. You rode the north line, she said eventually. 2 gaps closed. 3rd one, tomorrow. She nodded, went back to the bridle in her hands. Then Caldwell's men came twice. In August and again in September. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but something careful moved underneath it. The first time they said they were doing a property survey, Margot sent them away. The second time they were less polite. He stopped rubbing reckless. How much less polite? Less polite in ways that required all 3 of us to be holding weapons before they decided to leave. She set the bridle down and picked up the next one. Margot didn't tell the Tucson lawyer about the second visit. She didn't want to seem a pause. She has a very particular relationship with appearing capable of handling things. She is capable, he said. But nobody can handle everything alone forever. She looked at him then, directly, with those pale gray eyes that seemed to be reading something in the middle distance. Why are you really staying? It was the kind of question that deserved honesty. Because Caldwell lied to me, he said. And because I've been working other people's land my whole life, and I know good land when I see it, and this is good land. And because 3 women fighting off a Tucson banker with Winchester rifles while keeping 63 head of cattle alive through a drought as he stopped is what? Sierra asked. Worth helping. He said. She considered this for a moment, then turned back to the bridle, which he understood was about as much approval as he was likely to get from Sarah Hargrove on short acquaintance. He realized, already beginning to know how to read them. The days fell into a rhythm that felt, despite everything, almost natural. He was up before dawn. Always old habit from too many years of ranch mornings. He'd make coffee on the small camp stove in the barn tack room, where he'd set up his bedroll, and drink it in the dark, listening to the property settle and breathe around him. Then work. The 3rd fence gap. The barn roof sistering. A broken axle on the work wagon that he diagnosed and improvised a fix for using parts. Was cannibalized from a rusted cultivator in the back of the barn. Margot appeared at the first light every morning. He was never sure when she slept. She moved through the early hours with a kind of contained, urgent energy, checking the cattle, walking the irrigation channel, doing the 100 small assessments that a farm required. Sometimes their paths crossed in the gray pre-dawn, and they'd exchange brief, practical words about the day's work. The north pasture gate is sticking. I'll look at it after the barn. The wheat field needs water before Thursday. I can run the irrigation tomorrow evening. It was the language of people who worked together, which was not the same as the language of people who knew each other. But somewhere in the first week, the edges of that language began to soften. Not much. Not in ways she would have admitted. But enough that he noticed. The evening of the 5th day. He was working late on the barn roof. The October days were shortening, and he was trying to get the new roofing boards nailed before the light failed. And he heard her come into the barn below him. He didn't announce himself, and she didn't know he was up there. And so, for a few minutes, he heard what she did when she thought she was alone. She sat with the horses, not feeding them, not checking on them. Just sitting on the hay bales between Dust's stall and the stall that had belonged to her father's old gelding, who died the previous spring. She talked to Dust in a low voice. He couldn't make out the words. He stopped working instinctively, not wanting to intrude on whatever this was. Her voice, in that moment, had a texture he hadn't heard in it before. Softer, tired in a way that her daytime voice never allowed itself to be. He sat very still on the roof in the gathering dark and felt something in his chest that he didn't have an immediate name for. He made a deliberate noise, shifted a board, let it knock against the roof. Below him, her voice stopped. I'm up here, he called down, finishing the last section. Pause. You should have enough light for another 20 minutes, she called back. Practical, composed, all the softness tucked back away. That's what I figured. Another pause. He heard her stand, heard her murmur one last thing to Dust. I'll leave the kitchen lamp on, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, thank you. He heard her leave. He sat on the roof in the darkening air and looked out across the property. The pale thread of the irrigation channel catching the last light, the dark shapes of cattle on the northern ridge, the yellow squares of the farmhouse windows lit against the coming dark, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was somewhere he was supposed to be. That feeling alarmed him considerably. The trouble was the way she looked at him when she thought. He wasn't looking. He was careful about these things. He'd learned, in years of working in other people's spaces, to have a kind of peripheral vision for social dynamics, to notice things without appearing to notice them, to catalog the undercurrents of a house or a ranch crew without putting names to them. It was a survival skill as much as anything else. Margot Hargrove was not, on the surface, a woman who looked at anyone in particular ways. She was direct and efficient, and her attention was always purposeful. She looked at things she needed to assess. When the assessment was done, Her attention moved on. That was the surface. Underneath it, there was something different. He'd catch it at the table, her eyes on him for a half-second too long when he said something. And then immediately and deliberately on something else. In the barn, when they worked near each other, she maintained a precise and consistent distance between them that was just slightly more consistent than it needed to be. On the third day, he'd been lifting a heavy barn timber, and she'd come to take the other end without being asked. And they'd maneuvered it into place together, and for a moment, they'd been very close. Forearms almost touching, both breathing hard from the effort. And her eyes had met his, with an expression so quickly shuttered that he wasn't sure, afterward, whether he'd imagined it. He hadn't imagined it. He knew better than to do anything about it. He was a man who'd come to their land under false pretenses, even if the false pretenses hadn't been his. He was working here on an informal arrangement with no contract, sleeping in their barn, eating at their table when Bertie insisted on it, existing in the ambiguous space between employee and guest, and something there wasn't a word for. Margot Hargrove was fighting to keep her family's land, and she didn't need the complication of a ranch hand with inconveniently attentive eyes. He was very good at not doing anything. About it, he focused on the work. The pump broke. Again, on a Wednesday, not as repair, a different part entirely. The leather seal on the main cylinder worn through. He found it in the morning when he went to run water to the north section, and the pump produced nothing but a dry, mechanical wheeze. He dismantled it, assessed the damage, and went to the farmhouse to report to Margot, which was his practice for anything requiring materials or decisions. She was at the kitchen table with account books. She put face down when he came in. He pretended not to notice he was good at that, but in the brief moment before she turned them over, he'd seen enough. Columns of numbers, and the numbers were not good. He told her about the pump seal. She listened with her face neutral, doing the quick internal arithmetic he was coming to recognize. How much does this cost? What else has to give to make room for it? I can get a replacement seal in Harlow, he said. Harlow was the nearest town, 16 miles east. I'll need to take the wagon. How much? For the seal? Maybe $2. I'll need to look around. There might be other things worth getting while I'm making the trip. She nodded. She went to the kitchen shelf where a tin box sat, and she opened it. And he looked away while she did whatever arithmetic was required. When she came back to the table, she held out coins. $3, she said. Get the seal and whatever else is urgent. He took the coins. Their fingers didn't touch. He was careful about that. Margot, he said. She was already turning back to the account books. She paused. The account books, he said. I'm not asking to see them. I just want to tell you whatever the situation is, it changes the work plan. Tell me what you can afford and I'll make the rest work. She was quiet for a moment. He watched the back of her, the set of her shoulders, the particular tension she carried between her shoulder blades when she was holding something. We have $38, she said. After the hearing, if we win, the Tucson Bank will release the estate funds and we'll have operating capital. Before the hearing, she turned around. $38. He was quiet. The cattle will go to market in the spring, she said. It'll be enough to get through to next season. If we win the hearing, she said, if like it cost her something. He looked at her, really looked, which he was usually careful not to do for too long. The fatigue under her eyes that she never acknowledged. The way her hands on the table were very slightly clenched. You'll win the hearing, he said. You don't know that. He agreed. But you've kept this farm running for 14 months with 3 people and $38 and a stripped pump. And Caldwell's got lawyers and I'd still bet on you. Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, nothing so readable as that. More like a crack in a wall through which something warm became briefly visible. Make it the seal, she said. And the other things. He came back from Harlow in the late afternoon to find a man's horse at the fence. He recognized the brand before he recognized anything else. A Tucson stock brand. Nothing specific, but the saddle was expensive, and the horse was too well fed for a working man. He pulled the wagon to a stop, took a slow breath, and finished driving it to the barn before going to the farmhouse. The man was in the front yard. He was about 40, with the polished, rough look of someone who wanted to be taken for a self-made outdoorsman, but had grown up with money, soft hands, expensive hat, the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously opposed. He was talking to Margot, who was standing 3 steps up on the porch deliberately. Elias understood to maintain the height advantage. There was a second man, younger, sitting on the fence with the loose posture of someone who thought he might be needed and was ready for it. He had a pistol on his hip, worn like a statement. Elias came around the corner of the barn slowly, in the way he'd learned that working men moved when they wanted to arrive somewhere without announcing urgency. Simply making an offer, the first man was saying, in the smooth, reasonable tone of someone who had made his offer several times before and kept not understanding why it wasn't accepted. The estate debt is real, Miss Hargrove. The hearing will confirm that. What I'm proposing would resolve everything cleanly, Mr. Harding, Margot said, not raising her voice, not lowering it. Just filling it with iron. You have been on this property for 6 minutes, and I would like you to be off it in the next 2. Elias came to a stop about 15 feet from the younger man. Not confrontationally, he just stopped walking and stood there, and the younger man looked at him. And Elias looked back with the easy, patient expression of a man who has absolutely nowhere else to be. The younger man's confident posture shifted. Just slightly, Harding had turned at his approach. He looked Elias over with the quick, acquisitive assessment of a man who was used to measuring people. Who's this? My ranch manager, Margot said. Something flickered in Harding's eyes. Recalculation, the same kind Elias was learning to recognize, because the Hargrove women all did a version of it. But where theirs was strategic and honest, Harding's had something greedy in it. I wasn't told you had a manager, Harding said. There's a great deal about this property you haven't been told, Margot said. Harding looked between her and Elias once more, and then smiled the smile of a man who wasn't done. Just deferring. I'll be in Harlow through the end of the week, he said pleasantly. If you change your mind, I won't, Margot said. He tipped his hat, that particular tip that implied we'll see, and turned his horse and rode out. The younger man following, they watched them go until the dust settled. Then Margot sat down on the porch steps. It was the first time he'd seen her sit like that, not at the table. Not in a chair, but on the steps, elbows on knees, as if the strings that held her upright had gone briefly slack. She stared out at the road where Harding had ridden. Elias sat down on the bottom step. There were 2 steps between them. He didn't say anything. After a long moment, she said, Caldwell sent him. He's been doing this for months, sending different men with different offers. She was quiet. They keep getting less polite, I noticed. Pressed her lips together. I'm not frightened, she said. He didn't say anything. Want you to know that, she said. I'm not afraid of Harding or the man at the fence or Caldwell. I know, he said. I'm just... She stopped again. The word she was looking for seemed to require some significant effort to retrieve. Tired, she said finally. Just tired of it. He sat with that. Let it be what it was. 14 months is a long time to be the only person standing between your family and a bad man with a lawyer, he said. She looked at him sideways. Something in her expression had softened in a way that seemed involuntary, not weakness. Nothing so simple. But the particular quality of someone who has been spoken to honestly and found it unexpectedly affecting? Yes, she said. It is. They sat in the cooling evening air while the last light moved across the land. Somewhere behind the house, he could hear Bertie singing something cheerful and off-key, and the sound drifted out over the property like a small, persistent comfort. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was the kind that happens between people who have spent enough days working alongside each. Other that quiet no longer needs to be filled. Then Margot said, very quietly, Thank you for the pump. He looked at her. It was a cracked seal. It's not just the pump, she said. He understood what she meant. He looked back at the road, at the dust that had long since settled. I'm going to rehang the barn door tomorrow, he said. It's been giving you trouble. I know. Pause. I noticed you noticed. I noticed things, he said. Another silence. Different from the others. This one had a different weight to it, like a question that hadn't been asked yet, but was beginning to form. In the air between them, Elias, she said, Mom, why hasn't anyone hired you to run their own land before? She said it carefully, like a question she'd been thinking about for a while. You clearly have, she gestured toward the barn, the fence line, the property. You could have a position anywhere, a real position. With pay? He was quiet for a moment. I've had positions, he said. Good ones. Always on someone else's land. He looked out at the property. Doing good work on someone else's land is its work. It's honest. But it's like he paused, looking for the right words. You ever read someone else's letter? It's perfectly good writing. It just wasn't written to you. She was still looking at him. He could feel it without looking back. And this? She said. Is this different? He thought about the honest answer to that, and about all the reasons not to give it. And then about the 14 months she'd spent being the most honest person on this property by a significant margin. Yes, he said. This is different. The rain came on a Thursday. Arizona's October rains were not gentle. They arrived without apology and turned the hard-pan red earth into a sliding, treacherous mud that could swallow a fence post overnight. Elias had been watching the sky and had gotten the barn roof finished the previous afternoon, just under the wire. And he'd used the morning before the storm, too. Check the irrigation channel and make sure the diversion gates were in order. He was soaked through by noon. He came back to the barn to change into dry clothes he had, 2 sets of work clothes, and rotated them with grim practicality and found the barn already occupied. Sierra was there, working by lantern light at a drafting table she'd apparently set up against the east wall. She looked up when he came in, unperturbed. Change in the tack room, she said. I put the lantern on, thanks. He paused. What are you working on? She tilted the drafting paper toward him. It was a detailed technical drawing, a new irrigation branch, he realized, extending from the main channel into the east wheat field with a kind of elegant efficiency that would probably have the labor of a water run. Did you study engineering? He asked. I studied whatever books my father had, she said. And whatever I could get from the lending library in Harlow? A pause. And I look at how things work and try to understand the principles. This is good work, he said, meaning it. She looked at him. You understand it? Hydraulic gradient, he said. You've accounted for the elevation change here. We pointed to a spot on the drawing, which most people don't think about until their channel drains backward. Something in her expression opened. Just slightly. You understand hydraulics? I worked on an irrigation project in New Mexico, he said. 18 months. With an engineer from back east, he looked at the drawing again. This branch, you could extend it another 40 feet along the field edge if you angle it here. You'd cover the whole north section without a secondary pump. She looked at where he was pointing. Her pencil moved. She made a small, precise correction on the drawing. They spent an hour like that, him occasionally offering the engineering principle behind something she'd intuited. Her drawing with focused, exact strokes, and it was one of the more companionable hours he could remember. Because Sierra talked when she was talking about something that interested her, with a quiet, precise passion that was entirely her own. She had a mind that moved in interesting directions. Can I ask you something? She said at one point. Go ahead. Do you think Margot knows she's falling in love with you? He was very still, or Sierra reconsidered, tilting her head slightly. That's not quite right. She knows. She just doesn't think it's allowed. He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the rain came down steady and relentless, drumming on the new barn roof with a sound like approval. Sierra, he said carefully. I'm not teasing, she said. I'm telling you something true because I think you should know it. She looked at him directly, those pale gray eyes completely calm. She hasn't let herself want anything for herself in 14 months. Everything she wants is for this land, for us. She's forgotten that she's allowed to want things that are just, she paused. Just for her. He sat with that for a moment. I don't want to complicate things, he said. Things are already complicated, Sarah said. Caldwell complicated them. The debt complicated them. The hearing. She picked up her pencil again. You're not a complication. You're actually the least complicated thing that's happened here in a year. He didn't know what to say to that. He watched her draw. She won't say it first, Sarah said. In case you were waiting, found Margot in the south pasture that evening. In the rain, she was checking the irrigation gate, one of the diversion controls that needed to be adjusted during heavy rain to prevent flooding of the lower field. She was bent over the mechanism, working by feel in the gray, rainy light already soaked through. He came up beside her, and she didn't startle. She'd heard him coming through the mud. Gate sticking, she said. I see it. He crouched down, felt for the problem. The hinge was swollen with the wet. I need here. She pressed a short iron bar into his hand. She'd already worked out what the tool needed to be. He levered the gate open, felt the release of water into the proper channel, heard the flow change. They stayed crouched over the gate in the rain. He became aware, in the particular way he'd spent 3 weeks training himself not to be, of how close she was. Her shoulder almost against his, her breath visible in the cold, wet air. Her hands on the iron gate housing and his just beside them. He straightened up. She did too. They were standing very close in the narrow channel path, and the rain was coming down, and her hair was flattened wet against her face. And she was looking at him with an expression that had none of the careful engineering of her normal face. No composure, no iron, no practiced neutrality. Just Dasher. Just Margot Hargrove standing in the rain on her father's land, looking at him like he was something she hadn't expected to find. Here but wasn't sorry to have found. Elias, she said. No, he said. You don't know what I was going to say. I know, he said again, a long beat. The rain falling between them and around them and on them both. Her eyes searching his face. The hearing is in 3 weeks, she said. Yes, everything is. She stopped. Complicated, he offered. Yes. A breath. Yes, it is. He should have stepped back. He knew he should. He was very aware of the distance between them, less than a foot now, because they'd both been leaning slightly in without noticing, the way people do when they're saying something important and want to be sure it's heard. When the hearing is over, he said, and you've won if I win, he said firmly. When you've won and everything settles, I'd like to talk about what this is. She was very still. This, she repeated, you and me working the same land, he said. Having the same conversation every morning before the sun's up. The way you gave me that iron bar just now, without me asking for it. Pause. I'd like to talk about what that is. The rain fell between them. She was looking at him with that stripped-down expression, the one without armor. I'm not good at talking about things like that, she said finally.
No, he said.
We can start simple. Something happened in her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was warmer than anything he'd seen from her yet. It was so brief, just a fracture of light through the gray of the rain, but it was real, and it was for him specifically. And he would have ridden another 400 miles in any weather for it. Simple, she said. One thing at a time, he said. She nodded. Just once. And then she turned back toward the house, and he followed. And they walked through the rain together in a silence that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of something rather than the careful maintenance of nothing, Bertie noticed. Of course she did. Bertie had the bright, interested attention of a bird, which was presumably how she'd gotten the name, and nothing on the property escaped it for long. She didn't say anything directly. She wasn't unkind, but she had a way of arranging herself near interesting things. And for the next several days she seemed to frequently find reasons to be in whatever room or barn or field. Also contained both Elias and Margot. She was... Elias understood, delighted Margot, who had also noticed this arrangement, was visibly oscillating between fond exasperation and genuine mortification. He'd caught her more than once, giving Bertie the specific flat look that communicated. "I know exactly what you're doing," to which Bertie consistently responded with a wide, innocent expression that communicated, "I'm simply here for the farming," with complete implausibility. Sierra, for her part, said nothing about their conversation in the barn. She simply continued drawing her irrigation plans and occasionally giving Elias a slightly tuning look of someone who had offered good information and was tracking whether it would be used. The work continued. But something had changed, or rather, something that had been changing gradually was now changing slightly faster. Margot still maintained her practical distance. She was still all iron and assessment in the presence of others. But in the small moments, the pre-dawn exchanges over coffee that she'd started bringing to the barn tack room, just leaving it by the door. No ceremony, gone before he emerged. The evenings when their paths crossed at the end of a long day. In those moments, the careful distance had a different quality to it. It was still present, but it was the distance of a person who was thinking about closing it, which was entirely different from the distance of someone who'd never considered it. He didn't push. He wasn't built for pushing. He'd meant what he'd said in the rain, one thing at a time, and he understood that. Margot's relationship with wanting things was something that needed room to exist before it needed to be. Named what he hadn't anticipated was Marcus Webb. Rode in on a Saturday morning, a day Elias had spent half of mending tack and the other half helping Bertie identify what seemed to be a potential leak in the water storage tank. He was a young man, perhaps 24, with an easy, sun-warmed handsomeness and the confident ease of someone who'd always been well received. And he pulled up to the house with the familiarity of someone who'd been here before. Bertie, who'd been in the yard, saw him first and made a small, complicated sound. "Elias," she said. He looked up from the tank. "That's Marcus Webb," she said. "He owns the Webb spread. About 8 miles north." She paused. He and Margot, another pause, with more content in it. She seemed to be selecting words with unusual care for Bertie. "He's asked Margot twice about the possibility of a partnership. Business," and she appeared to give up on delicacy. "He wants to marry her. She's said no twice. But he keeps." She looked at Ilias's face. "Coming back," she finished. Margot came out of the house at the sound of Webb's arrival with the same measured, ready look she brought to most external things. She and Webb spoke in the yard. Elias could see them from the tank, not hear them, and there was a particular quality to their interaction that he found himself analyzing with more attention than was strictly necessary. Webb was animated, leaning toward her. Margot was contained, her arms crossed in the subtle, defensive architecture that he'd learned to read. She said something. Webb said something else. Her chin lifted in the way it did when she was deciding something. Elias went back to the tank. He worked on it for another 40 minutes. Found the small crack in the sealant joint, mixed a patch compound, applied it with the methodical focus that he was very good at, bringing to tasks when he needed to think about something other than what he was thinking about. Webb was still there when he came back to the barn. He was helping Margot carry fence supplies from the wagon, supplies that Elias had unloaded and stacked yesterday, actually, and which didn't need to be carried anywhere, but which provided an occasion for Webb to be helpful in Margot's proximity. Elias understood this maneuver with the comprehensive irritation of someone who'd never used it themselves. He went into the barn. He started on the tack he'd been meaning to clean. He was very focused on the tack. Sierra appeared beside him. "He's a good man," she said. "I'm sure he is." She said no twice, Sierra said. "You mentioned..." "She doesn't love him," Sierra said. "She's been trying to a little, because he's steady, and he has land, and it would solve certain problems. But she doesn't." He cleaned the bridle with more attention than it required. "Sierra," he said. "You're jealous," she said. Not cruelly, just factually in the way she said most things. "I'm working," he said. "Both can be true." He set the bridle down. He turned and looked at her. She looked back with those calm, reading eyes. "What would you like me to do with that information?" he asked. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "Just know it. Know that you feel it." A pause. The things you know about yourself make better decisions than the things you don't. He picked the bridle back up. Has anyone told you that you're somewhat unsettling? He said. Frequently, Sierra said, and went back to her work. Webb stayed for dinner. Bertie's doing. Generous as always, and Elias. Ate at the same table in the particular atmosphere of a social situation with several distinct undercurrents, most of which everyone was pretending not to notice. Webb was genuinely pleasant. He was funny in a broad, easy way. And he was kind to Bertie and respectful to Sierra, and he looked at Margot with the open, earnest regard of a man who'd made his intentions clear and was still hoping they might yet be returned. Elias. Across the table was quiet in the way he was always quiet at meals, listening, observing, occasionally contributing when directly engaged. He watched Webb watch Margot and felt the specific, comfortable quality of caring about something you haven't said you care about yet. He caught Margot's eyes once, across the table. Just once, she'd said something to Webb, and then her gaze had traveled the table automatically. The habitual survey of anyone responsible for a household, and it had landed on him and paused, just for a second, 2 seconds, the length of a breath. Then she looked back at Webb and answered whatever he'd said, but the quality of that 2 seconds stayed with Elias for the rest of the evening. It wasn't nothing. It was very specifically not nothing. Webb left after dinner, and the night settled over the farm with the particular chill of an autumn that was deciding to become. Winter. Elias was in the barn. He was not sleeping. It was too early for that, and his mind was doing the thing minds did when they were working on something they hadn't quite resolved yet. He sat on his bedroll with a lantern and tried to read and managed about 4 sentences of the same paragraph. 3 times before he put the book down, he heard her coming. Before she knocked on the tack room doorframe, he'd learned her footstep in 3 weeks, the decisive, even weight of it, the slight pause before she committed to a direction. The way it was the same at midnight as at dawn, because Margot Hargrove's composure did not alter with the hour. Come in, he said. She came in. She was in her night clothes, not that there was anything of note in this. Frontier women dressed practically, and the practical nightwear of a working ranch was flannel and wool, and not much different from workday wear. And she'd clearly been trying to sleep and failing, because she had the look of someone who'd been lying. In the dark, arguing with their own mind for an hour, she sat down on the stool across from his bedroll and looked at him. Marcus wants me to consider selling him an easement on the South Water rights, she said. In exchange for a pause, help with Caldwell. He looked at her. He said he'd speak to his lawyer, she said. File supporting documentation for the hearing. He has standing in the county, and Caldwell doesn't like him. She said this all in the flat, practical register of someone running calculations out loud. It might strengthen the case. It probably would. What's the easement worth? He asked. Not much, she said. The South Water's reliable, but not critical. The crop rotation doesn't depend on it. She paused. The problem is that selling the easement opens the door. Once the land is divided, the whole property is more vulnerable. If the hearing doesn't go perfectly, it's a risk you don't need to take, he said. She looked at him. You don't know that? Do, he said. Because you're going to win the hearing. And if you sell the easement to get there, you've let Caldwell's pressure do exactly what it was meant to do, Chip. Away at your position 1 piece at a time until you've traded everything to keep standing still. Quiet. That's easy to say, she said finally. When it's not your land, the words landed. He sat with them. You're right, he said. It isn't my land. Something shifted in her face, a flash of something that might have been regret. I didn't mean she started. It's the true thing, he said. I should probably remember it more clearly. The silence stretched. The lantern threw warm light across the rough wood walls, and outside the wind had picked up, and the barn breathed around them with its nighttime sounds. Elias, she said. Margot, I didn't come here to talk about the easement, she said. He waited. She was looking at her hands in her lap. Margot Hargrove, who looked directly at everything, was looking at her hands. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "In the rain, I remember what I said. One thing at a time," she said. "That's what you said?" "Yes." "I don't know how to," she stopped, pressed her lips together. "I know how to manage land," she said. "I know how to read water rights and negotiate with feed suppliers and balance an account book when there's almost nothing in it. I know how to keep 63 head of cattle alive through a drought." She paused. "I'm very good at things I had to learn to be good at." "I know," he said. "I'm not good at," she gestured vaguely at the space between them, which was not a large space. "I know that too," he said. She looked up at him. That unarmored expression again, the one that only appeared in specific conditions. In private, when she'd stopped managing how she looked. "Tell me the one thing," she said. "The simple thing you wanted to start with." He thought about it for a moment. "Stay," he said. She blinked. "I live here." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you, don't let Caldwell or Webb or anyone else maneuver you into giving away pieces of this place, because it seems like the practical solution. Stay all of it. Keep all of it." A pause. "The rest of what I want to say, the part that isn't about the land that can wait, but that part. The staying, I wanted to say it clearly." She looked at him for a long time. "You're protecting me from the conversation you actually want to have," she said. He was quiet. "I see you," she said. And the simplicity of it, the directness of those 3 words from this woman who used words like tools, precisely and only when needed, hit him somewhere square and central. "I know," he said. "I'm not ready," she said. "Not yet. There's too much," she gestured outward, toward the land, the hearing, Caldwell, all of it. "Too much that has to resolve first. I know that too." She stood. She paused in the doorway. "After the hearing," she said. "After the hearing," he agreed. She left. He sat in the lantern light for a long time. And the wind moved against the new barn roof, and the cattle were quiet on the ridge. And he thought that there were worse things than waiting for the right moment. When you had good reason to believe the moment was coming, 2 weeks later, they all rode to Tucson. Elias had offered to stay and watch the property. Margot had said, with the kind of casual firmness that ended discussions, that he was coming. He'd gone. He'd sat in the back of the Tucson County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in a clean shirt that Bertie had ironed without being asked, and watched Margot Hargrove stand before a judge and defend her. Father's land with the same steadiness she brought to every other thing she did the lawyer Caldwell had. Retained was expensive, that kind of smooth, expensive competence that bought you deference in rooms like this one. He had documents. He had affidavits. He had the practiced confidence of a man who expected to win. Margot had a general, practitioner from Harlow, who'd drawn up the will, and a hand-sewn portfolio of every document related to the Hargrove estate that she'd organized herself. And she sat beside her lawyer and spoke, when asked with a clarity and specificity that was, Elias thought, the most purely impressive thing he'd ever seen. When Caldwell's lawyer attempted to characterize the property as abandoned and non-operational, Margot's lawyer introduced Elias's written testimony, which Elias had spent an evening composing at the kitchen table, in detail that left nothing vague, describing the farm's active operation, the cattle numbers, the crop status, the infrastructure repairs, the functioning irrigation. When Caldwell's lawyer attempted to characterize the estate debt as superseding the will, Margot had, from her portfolio, a letter from a Tucson land rights attorney she'd apparently consulted 6 months ago, laying out the specific legal argument for why it did not. She had thought of everything. She had been thinking of everything for 14 months alone. And she had come to this room ready. The judge ruled at 2 in the afternoon. The property remained with the Hargrove estate. The debt dispute was remanded to a separate civil proceeding that Caldwell would be welcome to pursue, but which did not affect occupancy or ownership in the interim. Bertie made a sound in the gallery that was technically not a cheer, but which absolutely was. Sierra said nothing, but her pale gray eyes went very bright. Margot, at the plaintiff's table, sat very still for 3 full seconds. Then she gathered her papers back into her portfolio with precise, efficient movements. And she thanked her lawyer, and she stood up. And she turned and found Elias across the gallery with her eyes. She didn't smile. Margot Hargrove wasn't a smiler in the way of people who smiled at everything. But she looked at him with that stripped-down, unarmored expression, and in it was something that he could only describe as relief, the deep, structural relief of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. He nodded at her. Just once, she looked at him for one more moment, and then Bertie descended on her from the side, and Sarah was there too. And the three of them stood together in the courthouse light. And he sat back in his gallery seat and felt something that was not quite happiness, but was in the same territory, the warm, full sensation of having been present for something that mattered. They ate dinner in Tucson, celebration that was more practical than celebratory, because the Hargrove sisters were not given to excess. But Bertie had chosen the restaurant, and Bertie had a gift for finding the warmest table in any room. Elias sat across from Margot, and they ate and talked about the farm and the winter preparations and what the spring cattle market looked like. And it was the most ordinary conversation, and none of it was ordinary at all. On the road home, in the wagon in the dark, Bertie fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder by the second mile. Sarah read by the light of the wagon lantern. Elias drove. Margot sat beside him on the wagon bench. The road was quiet. The stars over the Sonoran were extraordinary, thick and cold and close. The kind of sky you only saw when there was no town light for miles in any direction. The horses moved steadily in the dark, and the wagon wheels found the familiar road home, and Elias let them guide themselves. Margot was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need to write to the bank tomorrow. Release the estate funds. Then to the feed supplier, we'll need winter stock, and I've been putting it off." She paused. "And the north fence on the far boundary needs, Margot," he said. She stopped.
"You won?"
he said. "You can have one evening." Pause. The horses moved. Stars wheeled overhead. "I don't know what to do with one evening," she said. "You could talk to me," he said. "About something that isn't the farm." "Like what?" He thought about it. "Tell me something about your father." She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. "Then he used to sing while he worked," she said. "Terribly. He had no ear for it at all. He'd sing the same 3 songs he knew from when he was young, always wrong, and he never noticed or cared." Pause. "I used to be embarrassed by it when I was small. When there were other people around." Another pause. I would give a great deal to hear it now." He didn't say anything. He let it be what it was. After a moment, she said, "Tell me something about where you come from." So he did. He told her about growing up in the Texas Hill Country, the youngest of 4 boys, and learning ranching from a father who communicated primarily through demonstrated technique and occasional grunts of either approval or disapproval. He told her about leaving at 16. Not unhappily, he and his father had been too similar in certain temperamental respects, and the farm had only been big enough for one of them to be stubborn on. He told her about the 12 years of working other men's land, and what that had given him, and what it hadn't. She listened. She was a good listener, not in the active, responsive way of someone performing attention, but in the still. A genuine way of someone for whom silence was a natural habitat, and who allowed others into that silence as a specific act of choice. "You could have land," she said. "Your own. A man who knows what you know. You could find backers, maybe," he said. "Why haven't you?" He looked at the road ahead, at the horses finding their way home in the dark. "I think I was waiting to find the right land," he said. She turned to look at him. He could feel it without turning his head. "Elias," she said. After the hearing," she said. "You said after the hearing, I remember." "It's after the hearing," she said. He turned to look at her. She was right beside him on the wagon bench, close enough that the cold air hadn't gotten between them. In the lantern light, her face had that direct, deliberate look. No storm cloud, no iron, nothing managed. "Just her, having decided something?" "Margot," he said. "Don't say something practical," she said. "I wasn't going to." "You might have been." A pause. You're quite good at being practical when it serves you. I learned it from you, he said. That fractured light in her face again, the almost smile, the crack in the wall. It was more visible now. She wasn't keeping it in as carefully. I'd like you to stay, she said. On the farm. Not as she stopped. Started again. I want you to stay, because I want you to stay. Not as the ranch manager. Not because we need the help, though we do. Because she pressed her lips together. Because I've spent 14 months not wanting anything for myself, and I'm tired of that too. He looked at her. One thing at a time, she said. That's what you said? That's what I said? Stay, she said. That was the first thing. It was. Then she exhaled slowly, a breath that took with it, it seemed, 14 months of held tension. Then we'll see about the next thing. He reached over and placed his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. She turned her hand over and held his. They didn't say anything for a while. The wagon rolled through the dark Arizona night, and the stars moved overhead, and somewhere in the back of the wagon Bertie sighed in her sleep, and Tangerine, who had somehow made the journey in her coat pocket, made a small sound of sleepy contentment. Sierra turned a page. Margot Hargrove's hand was warm in his. The bank letter first thing, she said. After a while, naturally, he said, and the feed supplier. Before noon, and then the north fence. We can look at it together, he said. She said. Week in spring came to the Hargrove farm on a Tuesday, not officially. The calendar had suggested it a week prior, but actually, in the way that spring comes to working land, the wheat field broke green and earnest overnight, and the cattle that had been lean and enduring through winter suddenly had the shifted, lively quality of animals that knew something was coming, and the irrigation channel that Sierra had designed and Elias had extended ran clear and cold through the morning light. Elias was up before dawn, as he always was. He had coffee at the kitchen table now, not in the tack room. The tack room had been reorganized into actual tack storage, and Margot came down the stairs at the first light the way she always did. And she poured herself a cup and sat across from him. And they talked about the day's work the way people who share a life talk about the things that need doing outside. The wheat field was green. Bertie was in the kitchen doorway with Tangerine, under one arm and a cup of coffee in the other hand, looking out at the morning with the bright, absorbing attention she brought to everything. It's going to be a good year, she announced. The south irrigation needs a check before we open the spring run, Sierra said from the table, without looking up from the document she was reading. She had been accepted 6 weeks prior to correspond with an engineering firm in Phoenix that had seen her irrigation designs and found them, the letter had said. Remarkably sophisticated for a self-taught practitioner. The letter now lived in a frame on the kitchen wall. A small act of ceremony that Bertie had insisted on, and Sierra had pretended to find embarrassing, and was very clearly not embarrassed by at all. I'll check it this morning, Elias said. Margot looked at him across the table. She was drinking her coffee, holding the mug in both hands the way she did on cold mornings, and her eyes had that direct, particular quality that had first caught him completely off guard on a porch in October and had not once since then failed to do something significant to his interior landscape. He looked back. The north herd needs rotating to the east pasture, she said. After the irrigation check, he said. Then we'll have time before the feed delivery at noon. If we leave by 7 works. I'll ride with you. Bertie made a small, satisfied sound and disappeared back into the kitchen. Sierra turned her page. Tangerine jumped onto the table and was immediately removed. It was an entirely ordinary morning. On a farm in the Arizona foothills, in the first real light of spring, it was Elias Colt thought. The finest, ordinary morning he'd ever had. Outside. The wheat was green, and the cattle knew something was coming. And the irrigation channel ran clear and cold. And the Hargrove land was exactly where it had always been, stubborn and beautiful and entirely, completely, defiantly alive. And when he finally told her properly, with no practicalities to hide behind and nothing left to wait for, she looked at him the way she'd looked at that letter in the courthouse, when she'd won, like something she'd fought for and earned, like it was hers.